The first thing Natalie Prescott learned about widowhood was that everyone assumes you need protecting. Her father had been dead for 6 weeks when her husband Brandon started managing the condolence cards. He sorted them by sender type: business associates, distant family, neighbors, people who'd attended the funeral but whose faces she couldn't quite place. He created a spreadsheet tracking who'd sent flowers, who'd made donations to the cardiac foundation her father had supported, who required personal thank you notes versus printed acknowledgments. "You don't need to think about this right now," Brandon said, his hand warm on her shoulder as she sat at the kitchen table staring at the stack of sympathy cards with their generic promises that time heals and memories comfort. "I'll handle the administrative side. You focus on processing." Processing, as if grief were a transaction that could be completed with sufficient attention. Her father, Harold Ashbury, had built Ashbury, industrial coatings from a single warehouse operation into a regional manufacturer with 3 facilities and contracts across the Midwest. Not huge, but stable, profitable enough that he'd never needed outside investors, never gone public, never complicated the ownership structure beyond the basics. When he'd had his first heart attack 3 years ago, he'd made Natalie a 40% shareholder. Brandon, who'd worked in the company's operations division for 8 years, held 10%. The remaining 50% stayed with Harold, who'd intended to transition it gradually as he stepped back from daily management. The second heart attack, the fatal one, had come without warning. Harold had been reviewing quarterly reports in his office when his assistant found him slumped over the desk, already gone. The will was straightforward. Natalie inherited Harold's 50%, giving her a controlling 90% stake. Brandon's 10% remained unchanged. The succession plan Harold had drafted with his attorney specified that Natalie would assume the chairman position, with operational decisions delegated to the existing management team until she felt ready to engage more directly. "We don't have to rush into any changes," Brandon had said the night after the will was read. They were in bed, the house dark and quiet around them. "Dad built something solid. The team knows what they're doing. You take whatever time you need." She'd appreciated that. The relief of not having to make immediate decisions while her mind felt wrapped in cotton, every thought moving slowly through fog. 3 days later, Brandon mentioned that Kyle Ridgway, the company's CFO, had some concerns about transition logistics. "Nothing urgent," Brandon assured her. "Just some corporate housekeeping, making sure your name is properly registered as primary shareholder, updating signatory authorities, that kind of thing. Kyle thought it might be easier if I handled the coordination, keep you from having to sit through boring administrative meetings while you're dealing with everything else." It made sense. Brandon understood the business operations. Kyle had been CFO for 12 years, had worked directly with Harold on every major financial decision. These were people her father had trusted. "That would help," Natalie said. "Thank you." The paperwork began arriving in weekly batches, amended operating agreements to reflect the new ownership structure, updated banking authorities to ensure smooth operations during the transition period, routine corporate filings required by state regulations. Each document came with a cover memo from Kyle explaining its purpose, usually in language that felt designed for someone with extensive legal training, rather than someone trying to grieve her father while maintaining basic functionality. Brandon would review each batch, highlight where she needed to sign, and walk her through the essentials. "This one's just confirming you as majority shareholder. This updates the registered agent. This authorizes the management team to continue operations without needing your approval for day-to-day decisions. Standard stuff so they don't have to call you about ordering new equipment or approving vendor contracts." She signed. Of course she signed. What else would she do? 6 weeks after the funeral, Brandon suggested she meet with Nicholas Fairfax, an attorney who specialized in corporate structure and succession planning. "Kyle recommended him," Brandon explained. "He's worked with several manufacturing companies in the area. Dad never got around to formalizing some of the governance details, things that seemed less important when he was healthy and planning to transition slowly. But now that you own 90% outright, there are tax implications, liability considerations, things that could become issues if we don't address them properly. Nicholas Fairfax had an office in a renovated, historic building downtown, all exposed brick and industrial lighting that probably cost more than functional overhead fixtures. He greeted Natalie with practiced sympathy, the kind that acknowledged loss without dwelling on it. "Your father built an impressive company," Nicholas said, settling behind his desk with a leather folder. "The fundamentals are strong, but there are some structural vulnerabilities that need attention now that the ownership has changed." He walked her through what he called exposure points. As sole majority shareholder, Natalie was personally liable for certain corporate obligations. If the company faced a lawsuit, her personal assets could be at risk. If there were ever environmental claims related to the industrial coatings, she could be held responsible. The corporate veil that protected shareholders in larger, more formally structured companies was thinner in family-owned businesses where ownership and management overlapped. The standard solution is to establish a holding company structure, Nicholas explained, pulling out diagrams that showed boxes and arrows depicting various corporate entities. You'd create a parent LLC that owns the operating company. Your shares would be held by the LLC rather than directly. It creates an additional layer of protection, limits your personal exposure, and gives us more flexibility for estate planning down the road. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like exactly the kind of thing her father would have done if he'd had more time. "Brandon mentioned you'd reviewed the company's financial position," Natalie said. "Does this seem necessary right now? Or could it wait a few months?" Nicholas glanced at Brandon, who'd accompanied her to the meeting. Just a flicker of eye contact, quick enough that she almost missed it. "The sooner the better, honestly," Nicholas said. "The liability exposure exists from the moment ownership transferred. Every day we wait is a day of unnecessary risk." Brandon leaned forward. "We could structure it so you don't have to be involved in the details. Nicholas would handle the formation, Kyle would manage the transfer of shares, and you'd just need to sign the foundational documents. Then we'd all have peace of mind that everything's protected properly." Peace of mind. As if that were something that could be manufactured through sufficient documentation. She agreed. What else would she do? The formation documents for Ashbury Holdings LLC arrived 2 weeks later. Natalie signed as the sole member and manager. The operating agreement transferred all her shares in Ashbury Industrial Coatings to the LLC, which would then hold them on her behalf. Clean, protected, exactly what Nicholas had described. "One last piece," Kyle said when he stopped by the house the following weekend with another folder. Brandon had invited him over, said it would be easier to review the final paperwork in a comfortable setting rather than the office. "We need to establish voting protocols for the LLC. Just a formality, but since you're the manager, we should document how you'll make decisions on behalf of the holding company." The document was titled Amended and Restated Operating Agreement, Voting Provisions. Kyle walked her through the key sections. As manager, Natalie would have authority over major strategic decisions, selling the company, taking on significant debt, changing the fundamental nature of the business. Day-to-day operational decisions would be delegated to the appointed officers. Currently, Kyle as CFO and Brandon as VP of Operations. "This just formalizes what's already happening," Kyle explained. "You're not involved in deciding which vendors to use or whether to approve a new equipment lease. That's operational management. But anything that affects the fundamental value or direction of the company, you'd have final say." She read through the provisions slowly. The language was dense, but the structure seemed logical. Strategic control remained with her. Operational flexibility stayed with management. She signed. 3 months after her father's death, Natalie returned to her own work. She was a technical writer for a healthcare software company, a job she'd kept throughout her marriage, despite Brandon's increasing income from the coding business. She liked the clarity of it, taking complex medical workflows and translating them into documentation that nurses and administrators could actually use. Problems had defined parameters. Solutions could be tested and refined. The first morning back, her manager assigned her to document a new patient intake module. Straightforward work, familiar territory. She spent the day in productive focus, the kind that didn't leave room for thinking about empty spaces in her life. When she came home, Brandon was in his office on a video call. She heard his voice through the closed door, animated and energetic in a way he'd been careful to modulate around her recently. "The Q3 numbers are going to make the case for us," he was saying. "Once we show the growth trajectory, the valuation model practically writes itself." She paused in the hallway, not intentionally eavesdropping, just caught by the unfamiliar tone. "Right, exactly. And with the governance structure we put in place, there's clear operational autonomy. That's what investors want to see. Management capability independent of founder family oversight." Something cold moved through Natalie's chest, a sensation she couldn't quite name. Not alarm, exactly. Just attention suddenly focusing. Brandon's voice continued, muffled but distinct. "Natalie's been great about trusting the process. She knows we're building something here. Once we finalize the Series A, everyone benefits. Her equity value goes up significantly. Series A, venture capital terminology, investment rounds, dilution structures, things her father had explicitly never wanted for his company." Natalie walked quietly to the kitchen, set down her bag, and stood at the counter staring at nothing in particular. Brandon emerged a few minutes later, his expression shifting when he saw her. "Hey, didn't hear you come in. How was the first day back?" "Fine." She kept her voice neutral. "What's Series A?" His smile flickered. "Work stuff. Kyle and I have been exploring some growth opportunities. Nothing urgent. How are you feeling? You look tired." "You mentioned investors. Potential investors. Exploratory conversations. The coding industry is consolidating. There's real opportunity if we position ourselves right." He crossed to the refrigerator, pulled out a beer. "Your dad was old school, wanted to keep everything small and controlled. But the market's changing. We could double the valuation in 3 years if we're strategic." Dad didn't want outside investors. Dad also didn't plan to die at 62. Brandon's voice was gentle, but something underneath it wasn't. The business he built was perfect for what he wanted. "But you're 40 years old, Nat. You're going to own this company for decades. Don't you want it to be worth something significant? Don't you want security?" The word security landed wrong, as if she were the one being unreasonable. "I thought we were protected now," she said carefully. "The holding company structure, the liability protection, wasn't that supposed to provide security?" "That's legal security, this is financial security, different things." He took a drink, watching her. "We don't have to decide anything today. I'm just saying it's worth exploring. Kyle has some contacts, people who understand the industry. We could take some meetings, hear what they're offering, no obligation." She wanted to say no, wanted to say her father had built something that didn't need to be doubled or strategically positioned or explored by people who understood the industry. But Brandon's face held that patient expression he'd perfected over the past 3 months, the one that said he was managing her grief, protecting her from complexity, holding space for her to be fragile. "Let's talk about it later," she finally said. "Of course, whenever you're ready." That night, alone while Brandon showered, Natalie opened her laptop and searched for the documents she'd signed over the past 3 months. She'd scanned everything, saved it all in a folder labeled Ashbury Business Transition. The holding company operating agreement was 73 pages. She read it carefully this time, without Brandon's explanations, without Kyle's cover memos. The voting provisions specified that operational decisions could be made by the appointed officers without manager approval. Operational decisions were defined as any matter related to the ongoing business activities of the subsidiary company, including but not limited to vendor relationships, capital expenditures below $500,000, personnel decisions, facility maintenance, customer, contracts, and strategic partnerships. Strategic partnerships. She opened a new document and started a list. That weekend, she told Brandon she wanted to attend the next board meeting. He looked up from his phone, surprised. The board meetings are pretty dry. Lots of financial review, operational updates. Kyle and I have been handling them. Dad's company had board meetings with outside directors. Not outside directors, just me, Kyle, and Martin Latimer from legal. We formalized it when we set up the holding structure. Nicholas recommended having documented governance procedures. When's the next one? Week after next. But really, Nat, there's nothing interesting. We're going through Q3 projections, reviewing the insurance renewal, talking about a potential equipment upgrade in the Louisville facility. I'd like to attend anyway. Something shifted in his expression. Not anger exactly, more like recalibration. Of course, you're always welcome. I just don't want you to feel obligated to sit through tedious operations discussions when you've got your own work to focus on. The meeting was held in a conference room at the main facility. Natalie arrived 15 minutes early and found Kyle already there, setting up a laptop connected to a projector. Natalie, he said, his smile professional. Good to see you. Brandon mentioned you wanted to sit in. Thought it was time I understood what's happening with Dad's company. Your company, Kyle corrected smoothly. You're the majority owner. Martin Latimer arrived a few minutes later, a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and a leather portfolio. He greeted Natalie with condolences, though she'd never met him before. Brandon came in last, carrying coffee and a stack of binders. The meeting proceeded exactly as Brandon had described. Tedious, technical, focused on operational minutia. Q3 revenue was up 7% year over year. The Louisville facility needed new curing. Ovens, estimated cost $380,000. Insurance premiums were increasing due to industry-wide environmental liability claims. Customer retention remained strong. Kyle presented financial projections showing steady growth over the next 3 years, assuming current market conditions. The numbers look good. Stable. Exactly what her father would have wanted. 40 minutes in, Kyle advanced to a slide titled Strategic Development Opportunities. As we discussed last month, he said, glancing at Brandon and Martin, but not at Natalie. We've been approached by Consolidated Industrial Partners about a potential investment opportunity. CIP focuses on growth stage manufacturing companies in the Midwest. They're interested in acquiring a minority stake to fund expansion into new markets. Natalie sat forward. We're selling part of the company. Not selling, Kyle said carefully. Taking on strategic capital, it would be a minority investment. CIP would get 15% equity in exchange for $8 million in growth capital. You'd still control 75% through the holding company. The math was wrong. She controlled 90% of the holding company, which owned 100% of Ashbury Industrial Coatings. If CIP bought 15% of the operating company, she'd still have 85% total. Why would my ownership drop to 75? Kyle and Brandon exchanged a look. Brandon cleared his throat. The investment would go into the operating company, not the holding company. We'd issue new shares to CIP. When you issue new shares, existing ownership percentages decrease proportionally. That's standard dilution. But I'd go from 90% to 75%. That's not proportional to a 15% investment. You'd go from 90% of the holding company to 75% effective ownership of the operating company. Kyle explained, his tone patient. Brandon and I would also be diluted. It affects everyone proportionally based on current stakes. The numbers still felt wrong, but she couldn't articulate exactly why. What happens to the other 15%? 10% would go to CIP. 5% would go into a management incentive pool for key employees. Kyle advanced to the next slide, showing organizational charts. That's standard in investment deals. You need to retain talent and align interests. Who are the key employees receiving the incentive shares? Another glance between Kyle and Brandon. That would be determined by the compensation committee, Kyle said. Likely distributed among senior management, myself, Brandon, the facility directors, a few others. Natalie looked at her husband. You'd get additional equity beyond your current 10%. It would be earned equity, Brandon said. Tied to performance metrics. And yes, it's in my interest for the company to succeed. That's the point of alignment. Martin spoke for the first time. This is a standard structure in private equity investments. The governance provisions protect majority shareholder interests while giving the investor appropriate oversight for their capital at risk. What governance provisions? Martin pulled a document from his portfolio. The investment term sheet. CIP would get board representation, 1 seat initially with provisions for a second seat if certain performance milestones aren't met. They'd have veto rights on major expenditures over a certain threshold, material changes to business operations, and any additional debt or equity raises. Veto rights, board representation, performance milestones that could trigger additional control. My father didn't want outside investors. Your father also didn't anticipate dying before executing his transition plan, Kyle said, his voice gentle but firm. The market has changed. Larger competitors are consolidating smaller players. We can either grow strategically or risk becoming irrelevant. Brandon leaned toward her. Nobody's forcing anything, Nat. This is just an option. But $8 million in growth capital could triple our revenue over 5 years. Your equity would be worth significantly more than it is now, even at 75% ownership. And if I say no? Silence in the conference room. Kyle closed his laptop carefully. Martin aligned the pages in his portfolio. Brandon studied his coffee cup. Then we continue as we are, Brandon finally said. Kyle and I have been doing some preliminary planning, getting the pieces in place so we could move quickly if you approved. But you're the majority owner. It's your decision. The phrasing bothered her. Getting the pieces in place, as if the decision were a foregone conclusion. I need time to think about it. Of course. Kyle's expression was perfectly understanding. This is a big decision. Take whatever time you need. We should probably move within the next month if we're going to move at all. CIP is looking at several opportunities. But there's no immediate deadline. No immediate deadline, just the suggestion that waiting might mean missing out. That hesitation could cost her. After the meeting, Natalie sat in her car in the parking lot and called her father's estate attorney, Dennis Hollowell. She got his voicemail. Dennis, this is Natalie Prescott. I have some questions about the business structure we set up after Dad died. Can you call me back when you have a chance? He called the next morning. Natalie, good to hear from you. How are you managing? I'm okay. I wanted to ask about the holding company we established. Did my dad discuss that structure with you before he died? A pause. The holding company was created after Harold passed. Why do you ask? Nicholas Fairfax presented it as something Dad would have wanted: liability protection, estate planning, flexibility. Nicholas is a competent corporate attorney. The structure he set up is perfectly sound from a legal perspective, but Harold never mentioned wanting to restructure his ownership. He was very clear about keeping things simple. Natalie's hands tightened on the phone. Would he have approved taking on outside investors? Harold? Absolutely not. He'd been approached multiple times over the years, always turned them down. He wanted the company to stay family-owned and independent. That was non-negotiable for him. Thank you, Dennis. Natalie, is something wrong? I'm not sure yet. That evening, she asked Brandon about Nicholas Fairfax. How did Kyle find him? Brandon looked up from his laptop. I think Martin recommended him. Or maybe Nicholas reached out. He specializes in manufacturing company transitions. Why? Dennis said Dad never mentioned wanting a holding company structure. Dennis handled estate planning, not corporate law. Different expertise. Brandon's voice was reasonable, explanatory. Of course Harold didn't mention it. He probably didn't know it was an option. That's why you hire specialists. But why did we need specialists for a structure Dad never wanted? Nat? Brandon closed his laptop, giving her his full attention. Your dad didn't plan to die. He didn't plan for you to inherit 90% of a multi-million-dollar company overnight. We had to make some decisions quickly to protect you, to protect the business. That's what everyone's been doing, protecting your interests. By setting up a structure that makes it easier to bring in outside investors my father explicitly didn't want. His expression hardened slightly. You're trying to make this sound sinister when it's just good governance. Yes, the holding company structure makes investment easier if we choose that path. It also protects your personal assets, simplifies estate planning, and creates clear operational boundaries. Those are all good things. You've been planning this for months. I've been planning for various scenarios, yes, that's my job. Kyle and I are running the business your father built. We're trying to grow it, strengthen it, make it worth something significant for you. I'm sorry if you think that's somehow betraying Harold's memory. She wanted to say that wasn't what she meant. Wanted to de-escalate, return to the version of reality where her husband was protecting her, and she was too grief-addled to see it clearly. But something had shifted. Some internal calculation had changed. I want to see all the documents we signed since Dad died. Everything. The operating agreements, the voting provisions, all of it. You have copies of everything. I want to review them with an independent attorney, someone who doesn't work with Kyle or Martin or Nicholas. Brandon stood. You're making this adversarial when it doesn't need to be. I'm trying to understand what I agreed to. You agreed to let the people who care about you handle the complexity while you grieved your father. That's what you agreed to. His voice was tight now, frustration breaking through the careful patience. I've spent 3 months managing this transition, keeping the business running, protecting you from having to deal with shit you're not equipped to handle. And now you're questioning my motives. I'm questioning the structure that somehow makes it very easy to dilute my ownership while claiming to protect me. He stared at her for a long moment. You don't trust me. I don't understand why we're having conversations about investors my father explicitly didn't want, using a corporate structure my father never planned for, with attorneys my father never worked with. Because your father is dead, Natalie, and the world doesn't stop moving just because you're sad about it. The words hung between them, sharper than he'd probably intended. Brandon left the room. She heard his office door close, heard the muffled sound of a phone call beginning. Natalie opened her laptop and started searching for corporate attorneys who specialized in shareholder disputes. The attorney she found was named Erica Merrick. Her office was an hour away in the state capital, far enough that Brandon was unlikely to have any professional connections there. Her website focused on representing minority shareholders, in corporate governance disputes and fiduciary duty claims. "Tell me what happened," Erica said when Natalie met with her 3 days later. Natalie walked through the timeline: her father's death, the succession, the documents, the holding company, the investment proposal, Brandon's increasing involvement in what he called strategic planning. Erica listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes. "Do you have copies of everything you signed?" Natalie handed over a folder. "I scanned everything." Erica spent 20 minutes reviewing the documents, her expression neutral and professional. "Okay," she finally said. "Here's what I see. The holding company structure is legitimate. The voting provisions are within normal parameters. The delegation of operational authority to management is standard. Nothing here is fraudulent or obviously improper." Natalie felt something sink. "So I'm being paranoid." "I didn't say that." Erica set the documents aside. "What I said is nothing here is obviously improper. But there are some things that concern me." She pulled out the amended operating agreement. This voting provision defines operational decisions very broadly. Strategic partnerships are included as operational decisions that management can make without your approval. That's unusual. Strategic partnerships could include joint ventures, merger discussions, investment relationships, things that materially affect company value and control. Brandon said it was just routine operational flexibility. It is routine for companies where management and ownership are already separated. But you're a 90% owner who should have absolute control. This provision creates a pathway for management to enter into significant agreements without your knowledge or consent, as long as they frame them as operational matters. Natalie's pulse quickened. Like an investment deal? Potentially, yes, if they structured it as a strategic partnership rather than an equity sale. They might argue it falls within their operational authority. Can we stop it? Maybe, but I need to understand something first. Erica leaned forward. Your husband works for the company. He has equity. He benefits financially from growth and investment. How confident are you that he doesn't know what he's doing? The question landed like a punch. I don't know anymore. Because there's a version of this where he's just enthusiastic about growth opportunities and didn't think through the implications. And there's a version where he's been systematically positioning himself and Kyle to execute a transaction that benefits them at your expense. How do I tell the difference? We get access to their communications: email, text messages, meeting notes, financial projections. If they've been planning this deliberately, there will be documentation. People like this always document their strategy. They think they're being clever. Natalie thought about Brandon's video call, the growth trajectory, the governance structure with operational autonomy, the careful management of her grief. What do I do? First, don't sign anything else, no matter what they tell you about deadlines or opportunities. Second, I'm going to draft a letter asserting your authority as majority shareholder and demanding access to all corporate communications related to any investment or partnership discussions. That's your legal right. How they respond will tell us a lot. They'll know I'm challenging them. Yes, and if they're operating in good faith, they'll comply immediately and explain everything clearly. If they're not, Erica paused, then we find out exactly what they've been planning and we stop it before it happens. The letter went out the next day. Natalie didn't tell Brandon in advance. She gave Erica permission to send it directly to Kyle, to Martin, and to Nicholas. Brandon called her at work 3 hours later. What the fuck, Natalie? She stepped out of her office into an empty conference room. What's wrong? Your attorney just demanded access to all company communications. You're treating us like criminals. You're treating me like I'm trying to steal from you. I'm exercising my rights as majority shareholder. By implying we're hiding something, by making this adversarial, Kyle is furious. Martin says this creates serious liability concerns. Nicholas is talking about potential claims for defamation if you're suggesting impropriety without basis. Then there should be no problem providing the information. The problem is you going behind my back, hiring an attorney, making accusations without even talking to me first. I'm your husband, Nat. We're supposed to be partners. Then partner with me. Explain why the corporate structure makes it easier to take on investors my father didn't want. Explain why operational decisions include strategic partnerships. Explain why you and Kyle have been having conversations about valuation and investor readiness without involving me. Silence on the line. I've been trying to protect you. I don't want to be protected. I want to understand what's happening with my father's company. It's not just your father's company anymore. It's a business with employees and obligations and opportunities. Kyle and I have been working to position it for growth. If you can't see that, if you're going to treat every strategic decision as some kind of conspiracy, he didn't finish. I'll cooperate with your attorney's request. We'll provide everything. And when you see there's nothing sinister, maybe you'll realize you've damaged some relationships unnecessarily. He hung up. The documents arrived 4 days later. Hundreds of emails, meeting notes, financial models, and investor communications. Erica's paralegal organized them chronologically and by topic. Natalie spent an entire weekend reading through them. The first substantive email was from Kyle to Brandon, dated 6 weeks after Harold's funeral. Subject: Transition planning. Brandon, now that the initial grief period is passing, we should start thinking strategically about the opportunity Harold's death has created. Natalie's controlling ownership gives us some flexibility we didn't have before. She's emotionally attached, but operationally disconnected. We can use that. The holding company structure will help. If we get that in place first, we can start moving on the investment conversations we've been avoiding while Harold was alive. He was stubbornly anti-investor, but Natalie doesn't have the same emotional attachment to independence. I'm setting up a meeting with Nicholas Fairfax. He's got experience creating governance structures that preserve nominal owner control while giving management operational autonomy. Exactly what we need. Thoughts? Kyle Natalie read it 3 times. The opportunity Harold's death has created. Brandon's response came the same day. Subject: R.E. Transition planning. Agree completely. Natalie's overwhelmed and wants someone else to make decisions. As long as we frame everything as protecting her, she'll sign whatever we need. The key is moving fast while she's still in grief mode. Once she starts engaging more actively, we'll have less flexibility. Let's get the holding company established ASAP, then start the investment discussions. The challenge will be keeping her trust while we dilute her. But if we position it as growth benefiting everyone, emphasize how much more her 75% will be worth than her current 90%, she should go along. We just need to be strategic about timing and messaging. Brandon. She read it. Again, her hands were shaking, while she's still in grief mode, keeping her trust while we dilute her. The next email chain documented Kyle's meeting with Nicholas. Nicholas had sent a proposed governance structure specifically designed to separate nominal ownership from operational control. The operating agreement provisions gave management broad authority over strategic decisions while maintaining the appearance that Natalie retained overall control. The key is defining operational decisions broadly enough to include most significant transactions, Nicholas wrote. As long as decisions can be framed as operational rather than fundamental, management can proceed without formal owner approval. A financial model showed projected dilution scenarios. In the base case, Natalie's ownership would drop from 90% to 75% through the initial investment. The model projected additional dilution to 60% through a second round of financing 18 months later, then to 45% through a strategic merger within 3 years. In every scenario, Brandon and Kyle's combined ownership increased while Natalie's decreased. An email from 3 months ago referenced managing Natalie's involvement. "She's starting to ask more questions about the business," Brandon wrote to Kyle. "I think losing her dad is finally hitting her, and she's looking for something to control. We need to be careful about how much information we share. The more she understands about the investment structure, the more likely she is to object." "I can keep her out of the board meetings," Kyle responded. "If she does attend, we just need to keep the presentations high level. She doesn't have the financial background to challenge the numbers." Another email from 2 weeks ago. "CIP is ready to move forward," Kyle wrote. "They're comfortable with the governance structure and the management team. They want to close within 60 days. The only variable is whether Natalie signs off. If she doesn't, we need to consider the alternative." Brandon replied, "The operating agreement gives us authority over strategic partnerships. We could structure the CIP deal as a partnership agreement rather than a straight equity investment. It's a gray area legally, but Nicholas thinks we could execute it without Natalie's explicit approval." "That's risky," Kyle responded. "If she challenges it after the fact, we could have liability issues." "Less risky than letting her kill the deal," Brandon wrote. "We've put too much work into this. And honestly, CIP is the kind of partner we need. If Harold were still alive, he'd be blocking every growth opportunity out of stubborn principle. At least Natalie might eventually see reason." "Let's try to get her buy-in first," Kyle replied. "But good to have a backup plan." Natalie set the emails aside and walked to the bathroom. She vomited quietly, then sat on the tile floor with her back against the wall, breathing carefully. The opportunity Harold's death has created. While she's still in grief mode, she doesn't have the financial background to challenge the numbers. She thought about Brandon's patient expressions, his careful management of her grief, his insistence that he was protecting her. She thought about Kyle's reasonable explanations, Nicholas's strategic legal advice, Martin's professional oversight. She thought about how many times she'd thanked them for handling the complexity. She stood slowly, washed her face, and called Erica. "I've read the emails. And? They've been planning to dilute me since the week after the funeral. They set up the holding company specifically to make it easier. They've been managing my involvement to prevent me from understanding what they're doing. Can you forward me the key communications? I'll send everything." "Good. I'm going to review them carefully. But based on what you're describing, we have grounds for a fiduciary duty claim. Your husband and Kyle are both fiduciaries. They owe you loyalty as majority shareholder. Using your grief to manipulate you into signing documents that benefit them while harming your interests is exactly the kind of breach we can challenge." "What happens next?" "We have 2 options. We can file a civil lawsuit seeking damages and injunctive relief, or we can try to negotiate a settlement privately. My recommendation is to start with a private demand. We lay out what we've discovered, we make it clear we're prepared to litigate if necessary, and we give them a chance to unwind what they've done before it becomes public. They'll deny everything, maybe. Or maybe they'll realize they've been sloppy, that their communications are damning, and that a lawsuit would destroy their reputations and their careers. People like this often fold when they realize they're actually going to face consequences. Brandon is my husband. I know, and I'm sorry, but right now, he's also someone who conspired to manipulate you for financial gain. You need to decide which of those facts matters more." Natalie thought about the email. "As long as we frame everything as protecting her, she'll sign whatever we need." "Draft the demand letter." The letter went to Kyle, to Brandon, to Nicholas, and to Martin. It detailed the email communications, the deliberate timing of the holding company structure, the plans to dilute Natalie's ownership, and the violations of fiduciary duty. It demanded immediate cessation of all investment discussions, full disclosure of all corporate activities and communications, and unwinding of any governance provisions that improperly limited Natalie's control. It gave them 72 hours to respond. Brandon came home that evening with the letter in his hand. "You really want to destroy us over this?" Natalie was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, reviewing the timeline she'd been building. "I want to understand what my husband has been doing. What I've been doing is trying to build something. What I've been doing is trying to turn your dad's small regional company into something significant. That's what I've been doing. By manipulating my grief, by using my trust against me, by making strategic decisions you weren't equipped to make. Yes, we framed things carefully. Yes, we managed the timing. Because you were falling apart, Nat. You couldn't make coherent decisions about what to eat for breakfast, let alone complex corporate governance. Someone had to step up. Someone had to steal from me? We're not stealing from you. Your equity value would increase substantially under the investment plan. You'd end up wealthier than you are now, even with the dilution. How is that theft? Because I didn't consent, because you knew I wouldn't consent if I understood what you were doing, so you engineered a structure that let you proceed without my meaningful approval." Brandon slammed the letter down on the table. "You're going to regret this. You're going to destroy my career, Kyle's career, probably cause legal problems for Martin and Nicholas. You're going to make enemies of everyone who's been trying to help you. And for what? So you can run a company you don't understand and don't even want to run? I'm going to protect what my father built. Your father built a medium-sized coating operation with limited growth potential. We were building a regional powerhouse. There's a difference. Get out. This is my house, too. And it's my company. Get out or I call the police." He stared at her for a long moment. "You're making a mistake. Maybe. But it's my mistake to make." He left. She heard his car start in the driveway, heard him speed away into the night. She sat alone in the quiet house and cried for the first time since her father's funeral. Kyle's response came through his own attorney the next morning. It denied any impropriety, characterized the email communications as routine business strategy, discussions taken out of context, and claimed that all actions taken were within the scope of proper management authority and in the best interests of all shareholders. The response demanded that Natalie retract her allegations and apologize for the defamatory implications. Erica called. "They're not backing down. What do? We file the lawsuit. Discovery will force them to produce everything, not just the emails we already have, but financial projections, meeting notes, communications with CIP, everything. If there's additional evidence of wrongdoing, we'll find it. And if they've been as sloppy as I think they have, we'll have them dead to rights. How long will it take? Months at minimum. Corporate litigation moves slowly, but we can seek a preliminary injunction to prevent them from proceeding with any investment or restructuring activities while the case is pending. That protects you from further dilution. Do it." The lawsuit was filed in county court. Natalie Prescott versus Brandon Prescott, Kyle Ridgway, Ashbury Industrial Coatings, and Ashbury Holdings, LLC. Claims included breach of fiduciary duty, fraud in the inducement, constructive fraud, and violation of shareholder rights. The local business journal ran a story 2 days later. Manufacturing company owner sues husband and CFO over investment plans. The article was vague on details but mentioned allegations of manipulation and unauthorized transactions. Natalie's phone started ringing. Friends asking if she was okay. Her mother, calling from Arizona, confused and worried. Colleagues from her own job asking if she needed anything. She stopped answering. She drafted a brief statement. "This is a private legal matter related to corporate governance. I have no further comment at this time," and sent it to anyone who asked. Brandon's attorney filed a counterclaim alleging that Natalie's lawsuit was frivolous and vexatious, designed to interfere with legitimate business operations. He sought damages for harm to his professional reputation and emotional distress. The preliminary injunction hearing was set for 3 weeks out. In the meantime, Erica's team deposed Kyle. The transcript arrived 4 days later. Natalie read through it, watching Kyle's carefully constructed explanations unravel under questioning. Q. When you emailed Mr. Prescott stating that Natalie is emotionally attached but operationally disconnected, what did you mean? A. I meant that she had a strong connection to the company as Harold's daughter, but wasn't involved in day-to-day management. Q. And you saw that as an opportunity? A. I saw it as a reality we needed to work with. Q. In the same email, you stated that the holding company structure would give you flexibility we didn't have before. Flexibility to do what? A. To pursue growth opportunities. Q. Without Mrs. Prescott's knowledge or consent. A. With appropriate management authority delegated through proper governance structures. Q. Mr. Ridgway, you wrote that Harold Ashbury was stubbornly anti-investor. Is that accurate? A. Harold had strong opinions about independence. Q. He explicitly opposed taking on outside investors, correct? A. Yes. Q. And Mrs. Prescott, as Harold's daughter and primary heir, was aware of his position on this issue? A. I assume so. Q. Yet you proceeded with investment discussions anyway? A. We proceeded with exploring opportunities that we believed would benefit all shareholders. Q. Including yourself? A. I'm a shareholder. Yes, I would benefit from value creation. Q. How much additional equity would you receive under the CIP investment structure? A. Approximately 3%, subject to vesting. Q. That would increase your ownership from 10% to 13%. A. Yes. Q. While Mrs. Prescott's ownership would decrease from 90% to 75%. A. The percentages would adjust based on the issuance of new shares. That's standard dilution mathematics. Q. Is it also standard to characterize a shareholder's grief as creating an opportunity for management? Long pause. A. That was poorly worded. Q. But accurate. A. I was discussing timing, not opportunism. Q. Mr. Ridgway, do you consider yourself a fiduciary to Mrs. Prescott as majority shareholder? A. I'm an officer of the company. I have duties to the company and all shareholders. Q. Including a duty of loyalty? A. Yes. Q. Does that duty of loyalty permit you to advance your own interests at the expense of the majority shareholders' interests? A. I haven't done that. Q. You structured a governance system that allowed you to pursue transactions you knew the majority shareholder would oppose based on her father's explicit wishes. You timed the implementation of that structure to coincide with her period of grief when she was less likely to question it. You planned to proceed with an investment that would decrease her ownership while increasing yours. And you concealed the full implications from her while characterizing your actions as protection. Is that an accurate summary? A. That's a hostile characterization of good faith business strategy. Q. Answer the question, please. A. The facts you've stated are technically accurate but lack context. Q. Thank you. Brandon's deposition was worse. He tried to maintain that he'd acted as a supportive spouse, helping his grieving wife, but the emails were too explicit. Q. Mr. Prescott, you wrote, as long as we frame everything as protecting her, she'll sign whatever we need. What did you mean by that? A. I meant that Natalie trusts us to act in her interests. Q. So you exploited that trust to get her to sign documents she didn't fully understand? A. I helped her navigate complex corporate structures during a difficult time. Q. By deliberately timing the implementation of those structures to occur while she was still in grief mode. Those are your words, aren't they? A. Yes. Q. You also wrote, the challenge will be keeping her trust while we dilute her. Correct? A. Yes. Q. That doesn't sound like acting in her interests. That sounds like manipulating her. A. I was planning for various scenarios. Dilution isn't inherently harmful if the overall value increases. Q. Did you explain to Mrs. Prescott that the corporate structure you were implementing would make it easier to dilute her ownership? A. We explained the structure Q. Did you explain that you and Mr. Ridgway had been planning to bring in investors since the week after her father's funeral? A. We discussed investment possibilities. Q. Did you show her the financial models projecting her ownership would decrease to 45% over 3 years? A. Those were preliminary models, speculative. Q. But you didn't show them to her? A. No. Q. Why not? A. Because she wasn't ready to engage with that level of strategic planning. Q. Or because she would have opposed it? A. Possibly. Q. Mr. Prescott, do you love your wife? Pause. A. This is a business dispute. Q. I'm asking whether you love the woman you married. A. Of course I do. Q. But you conspired to diminish her inheritance, undermine her father's explicit wishes, and manipulate her grief for financial gain. A. I was trying to build something valuable. Q. For yourself? A. For all of us. Q. But primarily for yourself. No response. Q. Mr. Prescott? A. I wanted the company to succeed. I wanted to be part of that success. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. Q. They are when your success requires your wife's loss. The preliminary injunction was granted. The judge found sufficient evidence of potential fiduciary duty violations to warrant protecting the status quo pending full adjudication. All investment discussions were frozen. Kyle and Brandon were barred from making any significant corporate decisions without Natalie's explicit written approval. The discovery process continued. More emails emerged. Communications between Brandon and Nicholas discussing how much we can accomplish before Natalie starts paying attention. Messages between Kyle and potential investors describing Natalie as a passive inheritor with limited business understanding. Financial projections showing Brandon and Kyle's combined compensation increasing dramatically under the investment structure tied to metrics that incentivize diluting Natalie's control. An internal memo from Kyle to his management team instructing them to keep board communications vague and technical to discourage Natalie's participation. Every piece of evidence reinforced the same pattern: deliberate exploitation of her grief, systematic concealment of their intentions, careful manipulation of her trust. 6 months into the litigation, settlement discussions began. Erica had made it clear that Natalie would accept nothing less than complete unwinding of the problematic governance structures, restoration of her absolute majority control, removal of Kyle and Brandon from any fiduciary positions, and financial compensation for the harm caused. Brandon's attorney suggested mediation. Erica agreed, but only if Brandon acknowledged the basic facts of what he'd done. The mediation was held in a conference room at a neutral law firm. Brandon sat across the table from Natalie, older looking than 6 months ago, exhausted in a way she'd never seen him. The mediator outlined the process. Erica presented the case: the timeline, the emails, the depositions, the evidence of calculated manipulation. Brandon's attorney presented their position. The investment plans had been in the company's best interests. The timing had been unfortunate, but not malicious. Management had operated within the authority granted to them. Mrs. Prescott was unfairly characterizing routine business strategy as conspiracy. "May I speak directly to my wife?" Brandon asked. The mediator looked at Erica, who nodded. "Natalie, I'm sorry." Brandon's voice was rough. "I'm sorry about how this happened. I'm sorry about the timing, about not being more transparent. But I wasn't trying to steal from you. I was trying to build something. I got caught up in the opportunity and I didn't think clearly about how it would look to you, how it would feel." "That was wrong." Natalie listened without expression. "But," Brandon continued, "I genuinely believed, I still believe, that the investment would have been good for everyone. Your equity would have increased in value. The company would have grown. Yes, I would have benefited. Kyle would have benefited, but so would you. That's not theft. That's growth." "You knew I wouldn't agree if I understood," Natalie said. "You knew my father wouldn't have approved, so you built a structure that let you proceed anyway. And you waited until I was too grieving to question it. I built a structure that protected you from liability while giving management the flexibility to operate. That's normal corporate governance. For companies where ownership and management are separate, not for a family business where the owner's supposed to have control. You had control. You always had control. You could have said no at any time. After you'd spent 3 months manipulating me into signing documents I didn't understand, creating relationships with investors I didn't know about, building a governance structure specifically designed to minimize my authority. That's not control. That's theater." The mediator intervened. "Let's focus on resolution. What would an acceptable settlement look like?" Erica laid out the terms. Complete dissolution of Ashbury Holdings, LLC. Return to direct ownership structure. Resignation of Kyle Ridgway from all positions with the company. Brandon Prescott to resign from all management and board positions. Independent board oversight for transition period. Financial settlement compensating Natalie for legal fees, time lost, and reputational harm. "Those terms would destroy my career," Kyle said. "I've been with this company for 12 years. I've done nothing illegal." "You've breached your fiduciary duty," Erica replied. "You've conspired to manipulate a grieving shareholder for your own benefit. The fact that you documented your intentions doesn't make them legal. It makes them provable." Brandon's attorney asked for a recess. They returned an hour later with a counteroffer. Kyle would resign, but receive 12-month severance and a neutral reference. Brandon would step down from management, but retain his shares and receive a consulting agreement for 1 year. The holding company would be dissolved and governance restored to pre-death structure. No admission of wrongdoing. "No," Natalie said. "Natalie," the mediator began. "No admission of wrongdoing means they get to walk away pretending this was a misunderstanding. They planned this. They documented their planning. They exploited my father's death and my grief to restructure his company against his explicit wishes. That's not a misunderstanding, that's betrayal." "What do you want?" Brandon asked, something breaking in his voice. "What will make this right? I want you to admit what you did. I want Kyle to admit what he did. I want you to acknowledge that you used my grief as an opportunity, that you timed your actions to coincide with my vulnerability, that you concealed your intentions because you knew I would object. I want the truth on record." "That creates liability." "Then you shouldn't have done it." The mediation broke down. The case proceeded to trial. The trial lasted 4 weeks. Erica presented the email communications, the depositions, expert testimony from corporate governance, specialists who testified that the structure was unusual and tilted heavily toward management control, financial analysts who showed that the dilution would have materially harmed Natalie's position even if the company's total value increased. Brandon's attorneys argued business judgment. That management had operated within their authority. that investment decisions involve risk and disagreement, that Mrs. Prescott was second-guessing legitimate business strategy after the fact. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found in Natalie's favor on all counts: breach of fiduciary duty by both Brandon and Kyle, fraud in the inducement regarding the holding company structure, violation of shareholder rights. They awarded $2.4 million in damages, the amount Natalie had spent on legal fees, plus compensation for the diminishment of her ownership value and control. More significantly, they issued findings of fact stating that Brandon Prescott and Kyle Ridgway had deliberately and systematically exploited Mrs. Prescott's grief following her father's death, and had engaged in a calculated plan to manipulate corporate structures for their personal benefit while concealing their intentions from the majority shareholder. The judge issued additional relief. The holding company was dissolved. All governance provisions restricting Natalie's control were invalidated. Kyle was barred from serving as an officer or director for any corporation in the state for 5 years. Brandon was required to divest his 10% ownership stake, with Natalie having first right of refusal to purchase at independently appraised value. Brandon sold his shares to a third party, a regional manufacturer who'd been a supplier for years. He used the proceeds to pay part of his legal fees and moved to a different state, taking a management position with a chemical company. Kyle filed for bankruptcy. The damages exceeded his assets. He eventually found work as a financial consultant for small businesses his reputation destroyed. Nicholas Fairfax faced a bar complaint for his role in designing the governance structure. The disciplinary board didn't disbar him, but issued a public reprimand for failing to ensure his client understood the implications of the corporate structure he was implementing. Martin Latimer, the attorney who'd served on the board, resigned from his firm. The finding that he'd participated in governance designed to diminish shareholder rights became public record, and his corporate clients began leaving. A year later, Natalie still runs Ashbury Industrial Coatings. She's appointed an independent board with expertise in manufacturing and corporate governance. She's implemented simplified reporting systems and transparent decision-making processes. She's declined multiple approaches from investors, maintaining her father's commitment to independence. Revenue hasn't doubled. The company hasn't become a regional powerhouse. It's remained steady, profitable, and controlled by the family that built it. She divorced Brandon 14 months after the trial. He didn't contest it. There were no arguments about property division. The prenuptial agreement they'd signed before marriage was clear and unambiguous. He took what was his. She kept what was hers. They don't speak. Sometimes she thinks about the life they might have had if he'd chosen differently, if he'd been honest about his ambitions, if he'd respected her enough to include her in the planning rather than managing her like an obstacle to navigate around. But mostly she doesn't think about him at all. She thinks about her father, who built something solid and left it to someone he thought would protect it. She thinks about the women who call her sometimes, referred by Erica, asking questions about corporate governance and whether it's normal for their late husband's business partner to suggest restructuring during the funeral planning. She thinks about the business, journal articles she was interviewed for, protecting family business from internal exploitation, and how many people emailed afterward saying they'd experienced something similar but hadn't known how to fight back. She thinks about power and grief and how often the people who claim to be protecting you are really protecting themselves. The anger hasn't disappeared. She's learned to recognize it as information rather than pathology. It tells her when someone's language doesn't match their behavior, when complexity is being weaponized, when trust is being confused with surrender. She doesn't apologize for it anymore. 3 months ago, she testified before a state legislative committee considering new corporate governance requirements. She described how the current legal framework allows sophisticated exploitation of unsophisticated owners. How disclosure without comprehension isn't really disclosure. How fiduciary duty means nothing if it can be structurally bypassed through operating agreements written in impenetrable language. The committee listened. They asked questions. They're drafting legislation. She doesn't know if it will pass, doesn't know if it will prevent anyone else from experiencing what she experienced, but she knows that silence is complicity. That accepting injustice as the price of keeping the peace is just another way of saying that some people's comfort matters more than other people's rights. Her father taught her to build things that last. She's building something he never imagined needing, a structure that makes it harder for grief to be weaponized, for trust to be exploited, for complexity to conceal theft. It's not healing, it's not closure, it's not acceptance, it's consequence. And consequence, she's learned, is sometimes the only justice available. She sits in her office at the company her father built, reviewing quarterly reports and approving capital expenditure requests and managing the steady, unglamorous work of running a business nobody's trying to steal anymore. She's not happy. She's not at peace. She's not grateful for the lessons. But she's here. She's whole. She's ungovernable. And some mornings, that's enough.